really, really do want to hear from people who have ideas about how we can connect with the places in which we live and work. And I also, I'm not sure whether I got a chance to thank Paige Wynn, who has been very much in the background in this whole thing. Paige, I feel so much better knowing that you're providing technical assistance and that if something goes wrong, you will correct it, because I certainly would not be able to do that myself. We're continuing our discussion of crisis in action, and just to sum up where we went with the first couple of panels this morning, we had students and faculty talking about how their work has been engaging with some of the pressures of the moment, and with the intertwined police violence and structural violence, along with the pandemic and the inequalities and violence that have been particularly vivid through responses to the pandemic. And in our last session in particular, for those who were able to join in, and even for those who didn't, some of the big issues that came up, I think, were really relevant for the ways in which we think about engaged humanities in particular, but also just humanities in general, because a lot of the conversation started to shift toward an understanding of really important questions like the relationship between theory and practice. How do age-old theories in humanities, and I love Nadine's expression, the theory Olympics. I want to use that expression, theory Olympics. How did big theoretical questions have a bearing on the way, or not have a bearing on the way in which people do their activist work? Or questions about revolution and reform. That was kind of where people were going in the last part of the question and answer period, when people were kind of hashing it out, whether small change is the way to go, or whether big revolutionary change is the only way in which one can address systematic injustice. And then I think another question that was kind of rumbling underneath all of this and was a big part of Shiben's presentation was, how do we talk to people who disagree with us, or not just disagree, but who are just on opposite sides of the political equation, and who are just not able to think in, or not willing to think in the way in which we do, whatever that is. That is, how is radical opposition engaged, either in thought or action? And so, these are questions that are important to us every day, but certainly important for the moment. So this panel in particular, the one that we're about to have, brings us really a lot closer to the action side of the title of our discussions today. And the impetus for it, as Alison and Ira will explain, is a new initiative from the Chicago Humanities Festival. That is how to connect humanities work with neighborhoods in which we live and work. And like I said earlier, what I hope is that we'll be able to have some fruitful conversation with everyone about where this initiative can go. So our guests speaking in this order, I'm just going to read off the names, and we'll just go in the order on the program rather than, introducing people separately. Our guests are Alison Cuddy, who is Artistic Director of the Chicago Humanities Festival. Ira Murfin is Program Manager for the Neighborhood Partnership, and he is an ACLS Mellon Fellow at the Chicago Humanities Festival. Ellen McClure is also joining us. She was earlier on the program. She is Director of the Engaged Humanities Initiative at UIC and also Professor of French. Enid Wells is a professor of media and communications at Kennedy King College. Darby Johnson is Dean of Instruction at Kennedy King. And Chloe Johnston is professor of theater at Lake Forest College. So we'll go in that order. And so, Alison, why don't you start things out and maybe introduce things for us?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to everyone for being here, both the panelists and the attendees. It's really great to be with you all, even if it's in very different circumstances than we might have imagined. And it's really exciting for us to talk about this new initiative that we're embarking on that builds on some of the things that we've been doing previously, and to be with all of our partners who we've been having super fruitful conversations with, convenings, commiseratings in this time of crisis. So, I'm just really happy to be here with all of you. And partnership is definitely a key word for CHF, both in terms of this new initiative, but in terms of what we've been trying to do with our expansion of programming into neighborhoods over the last 5 years. And then it's just kind of baked into who we are. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about that. I think there are some people here who are pretty familiar with CHF and others who are not, but it kind of leads us to this moment that we're in and how we're responding to it to some extent. So we've been around a long time. We celebrated our 30th anniversary last year, which is kind of hard to believe. And we literally started as a festival. We're the Chicago Humanities Festival. We're not really a festival anymore, but it was how we began, literally as one day of programs. It was an offshoot of the Illinois Humanities Council. But CHF quickly became an independent nonprofit, even though it stays in good partnership with Illinois Humanities. And particularly over the last 5-6 years, myself and our executive director, Philip Bahar, have changed the festival in terms of how it operates. So we've become a year-round presenting organization. Again, we have moments that look like festivals, but we're not a festival proper. We really have more expanded seasons, a spring season and a fall season within which we do most of our programming. I've been thinking a lot about this term crisis, and it's another key term, right? It's hard, I think, in the humanities, whether we're in the public humanities or within universities or both, often the word humanities is accompanied almost immediately by crisis. We've come to think of those two things together. But I think really what binds these partners together, Kennedy King, Lake Forest, University of Illinois at Chicago, and then Attendant, is seeing kind of opportunities in our shared and collective desire to be part of the communities that surround us, or a wide range of communities in Chicago, beyond our particular institution, but deeply connected to the mission of our respective institutions, that all of us are trying to expand our public profile and to engage differently. And that became ever more urgent when the whole onset of the pandemic happened. We literally had just sent out our spring program guide when the stay-at-home order came. So literally they were arriving in people's mailboxes when we realized that we were going to have to start working from home, and quickly realized we wouldn't be able to do any kind of public gatherings whatsoever. So that whole spring festival we've been working on for months was out the window. And the timeline for thinking about programming became far more extended, especially in terms of our traditional bringing people together programming. So we had to shift pretty quickly into this kind of environment, to doing programming online. And I think we were able to do that in ways that might, in some ways, were easier than it might be for other cultural organizations. And I'll just walk through some of those because I think it helps explain a little bit more about what it is that we actually do. So one of the things is that we are not tethered to physical space in general. I mean, we host public gatherings across the city, in communities across the city, but we don't have our own building, our own facility. And so there's a kind of mobility that's part of the festival experience that I think allowed us to kind of take this leap into digital space pretty quickly, or think of it just as another kind of venue rather than a kind of radical transformation, even though I think ultimately it has lots of radical potential, which I hope we'll talk about. the mode of what we do, we bring people in conversation together. We believe that people talking on stage is a way to engage in thinking more deeply. We really try to prioritize conversation. We also have performance, we do screenings, we have all kinds of interactive experiences, but conversation is critical to what the CHF experience is like. And that translates, as you're experiencing today, pretty easily into digital space. One of the potentials of that transformation has been the way audiences can engage with content. It is much more, you can interact with what's happening in real time. So, we use a Zoom environment, but broadcast on YouTube, and we just see incredible engagement, not just with the presenters or what's happening on stage, but with the various audience members who are part of that experience. That becomes part of the experience of the event itself. And so there was a kind of willingness of audience, both those who were engaged with CHF already, but beyond, to really jump into that. Our programming is thematically driven, even though we embrace the diversity of the humanities and interpret them super broadly. The fact that we have something that kind of organizes our programming. Our theme this year is vision, but we've done themes like power, citizens, and others previously. I think that gives a kind of connective thread to our programming that allows a kind of narrative to evolve even within digital space. And then partnerships are super important as well. We do everything in partnership. And so as we thought about what moving on to digital space looked like, the fact that we had so many different thought partners willing to engage in that conversation with us, I think allowed that transition to happen in an easier way in some sense. Or it's kind of like coming together and trying to figure out how to do this all together. And then finally, as we moved the festival to a year-round presenting organization, we also thought about what is the content of what we do. I think that historically the festival had thought about itself as a space where you could kind of withdraw from the world and reflect on big critical issues, timeless topics. But increasingly we're trying to have been engaging with the world in multiple ways. And so that really drove our thinking about what are we going to do as we move into digital space. And one of those things was to really be engaged with what's happening and try to be a space where how people are experiencing this moment could be articulated and communicated to a broader audience and shared. And so the focus on neighborhoods, even though at first it felt like we're not going to be able to do neighborhood programming because that's all about gathering together in these small groups and working really intently. Instead, we found opportunity in realizing that what was happening in Chicago neighborhoods wasn't as visible to all of us as what might be happening, say, in New York or somewhere across the globe. And so there was a real opportunity, and we weren't alone in doing this for sure, but to bring people together who are part of a community to talk about those experiences. So I think that's just one way I'd flag at this moment about how we're trying to, as Mark was saying earlier, how do we engage with this current moment? And I'll hand off to Ira, who, partnership is in its very title, to talk a little bit about what our neighborhood strategy looks like at this moment based on what we were planning and now how we're evolving that related to this ongoing pandemic.
Thanks, Alison, so much, and thanks, Mark, and everybody for having us and giving us a chance to come together and have this conversation, open it up a little bit more. Conversation that we've already started and have really been gaining a lot from, I think. So as Mark and Alison said, I'm the program manager for neighborhood partnerships, so specifically focusing on this kind of move into a focus on sustained partnerships in Chicago's neighborhoods, building on the festival's increased neighborhood programming over the last several years, and also that position comes through this the ACLS Mellon Fellowship that I think in and of itself is kind of an example of putting the humanities into action. It's a fellowship that supports recent humanities PhDs moving into kind of public-facing, publicly engaged roles. And so I'm really excited to have that position, but I'm also really excited just that exists as a structural way to help PhD students think about various pathways forward. So the Neighborhood Initiative the idea is really to think about not only programming in different neighborhoods, but building a sustained presence and sustained relationships in Chicago's neighborhoods over time, and collaborating with organizations, institutions, community stakeholders in those communities. And to start with, we've identified a cluster of neighborhoods on the South Side, South Shore, Bronzeville, Englewood, Washington Park, that area of the South Side where some of the neighborhood programming had already been happening. We already had partnerships and relationships in the works as sort of the pilot for this approach. And I've really spent the first year of my fellowship building some of those relationships, doing a lot of work, research, convening an internal working group at CHF to start to think about how this programming initiative changes and evolves CHF itself. And one of the real, I think, triumphs so far has been the relationship that we've started to build with Kennedy King College, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit more. But we found, Kennedy King, an institution based in Englewood, one of our target neighborhoods, that our two institutions had similar interests, similar goals around sort of thinking about the public life of the humanities and the arts on the South Side. And Darby and Professor Wells from Kennedy King can talk a little bit more about those initiatives at Kennedy King. And so really the idea is to move now into kind of putting this pilot program in action over the next year. That will mean, thanks to a grant from the Mellon Foundation, hiring a pre-doctoral fellow to help with sort of research and documentation, community facilitators to help connect us with community members, stakeholders, organizations, and to engage a process of community planning, community input, to really think about what programming in these spaces with these institutional partners might look like. And I think starting with these academic partners has been really key, but I think we want to then think about who else is in this space, what other organizations and kinds of institutions might have a stake in these conversations and in bringing these conversations to the neighborhood. So hopefully that's something we can think about in this space. And and of course we're also thinking, as Alison said, about what that means to do neighborhood programming if we're not physically in the neighborhoods or the same neighborhoods together. And so one of the things that we've come up with so far is the series of neighborhood check-ins as part of our digital programming, which we started in the spring by really just checking in with one community organization in Englewood, RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood, and spoke to two of its founders, Tanika Johnson and Aisha Butler, sort of about, it's very early in the pandemic, about sort of what was happening on the ground, and as Alison said, to kind of give a platform to what's happening in this neighborhood that's not far from where we are, but that we may not have a lot of information about. And we've kind of been able to be responsive with this series. We did, my colleague Hunter Affa, who works on youth initiatives, did a neighborhood check-in about youth activism in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer. And in this fall, we really want to start to think about the institutions that we're working with, think about cross-neighborhood conversations. So we'll actually this is really kind of part one of a conversation. Part two will bring together these same three institutions of higher ed and CHF for a CHF program, checking in about higher education and higher education institutions as sort of neighbors and citizens on September 9th at noon. So mark your calendars for that. And that series will continue through the fall, looking at issues like art and culture as a driver of neighborhood economic development, community organizing. We've been talking about community-based journalism. So looking at some of the structures and institutions that are sort of invested in these neighborhoods. So hopefully this is a conversation that can start here and continue into these other programs this fall, and then hopefully into our neighborhood programming as it's sort of embodied and imagined over the next year. And I should say that that planning process will culminate also in public programming of some sort at the end of next summer. Whether that's going to be in a place or every place is still to be determined, but that's part of what we'll discover in the coming year. Thanks so much.
Ellen, do you want to go ahead? This may be an opportunity for you just to talk a little bit about what our students are doing, and I could chime in if we have a little bit of time to talk about. I've been talking to faculty about what they're up to, but you can go ahead.
Sure. And yeah, it's good to see everybody. And thanks again, Mark, for putting this together. And thanks again, Alison and Ira and everybody else. This is really exciting. And I think especially after the last panel, I have the moments where I'm, as a 17th century French literature specialist, I get community imposter syndrome. And I'm probably, how do I say? We have. I think you were able to see with the last panel, and we have so many faculty members, and this is where Mark can speak to this. That our students work with as mentors, who are and have been doing incredible community work, and really connecting scholarship with the community in really exemplary, not just exemplary, but also groundbreaking ways, and really on the forefront of that. And it's just, once again, it's really a privilege to be able to work with all of them and put students together with these faculty members and these projects. And I'm learning a lot. And actually, it just occurred to me a few minutes ago that I'm unlearning a lot, which is also a lot of fun. And at my age, probably overdue. And so, but the Engaged Humanities Initiative, it's a 4-year program, and the students have 2 funded summers. They receive from the grant $3,500 for 2 summers to develop a project. And as Nadine mentioned, that project can take many, many different forms. It doesn't have to be a straight up research project. And they can do internships as part of that, or work with community groups. And so we're very hopeful. And I met with Ira. I believe Ira and I met like the day before everything went dark. It was March 12th, and at the Port Cafe. But I'm hopeful that this will be really a wonderful partnership to help, number one, just expose our students to what is possible. I think what happens a lot, especially with undergraduates in the humanities and even old humanists such as myself, to really broaden their horizons and get an idea of what community engagement and what this kind of work looks like and what it entails. I'll also say that we were really excited last year. I believe it was last fall, we managed to connect Engaged Humanities students with tickets for Chicago Humanities Festival events, and with the grant money, and get them tickets and send them off to that as part of during the school year. They go to events and get some grant money for that. So I think it's going to be, it's already a wonderful partnership. I think it'll be even more productive. It would be great. We almost had an intern this summer working with Ira, but just to keep those contacts going, and like I said, to really expand my own ideas and the students' ideas of what's possible. And one of them actually said to me, they said, "Oh, Ellen said that everything that you read or watch or see can be fuel for a humanities research project." And he said, "I thought of that, and I realized, I was watching this TV show and I could use it for my research." So working with the students all summer and just seeing them realize that they were doing humanities kind of all the time, or that doing oral interviews with their mother and grandmother, that's part of this, that they bring so much to the table by virtue of where they come from and the communities where they live or where they come from. So I think this is just a really natural and exciting partnership. And again, I'm one of the least qualified people here to talk about it, but I appreciate being part of the conversation.
Can I just slip in something here too? Thank you so much, Ellen. I wanted to say just a little bit about just what is ahead for that discussion in September and in the types of discussions that we'll have with this group. Number one, that I hope that we'll continue to be able to work with the Engaged Humanities Initiative and give our students opportunities to voice what concerns are important to them in their communities, and this can feed into some of the directions of this neighborhood conversation. And I've also been talking with faculty about some of the projects that they're engaged in, often with students, with undergraduate and graduate students. For example, work on policing and surveillance. And, it occurred to me just how incredible it would be to have some kind of conversation around policing that would draw in multiple genres. I mean, we have a film scholar at UIC, Sarah Hall, who's done work on the police in film. And, lots of people who talk about this in literary studies, and just combining this in a really interesting discussion with issues that are germane to the moment. There are also people who are working in activist ways with gentrification and issues of real estate and race and ethnic division around property ownership, Ralph Centrone in particular. And in September, I'll be able to fill in a little bit more about that work. Rachel Havelock, who's with us right now in the attendees with her freshwater lab. She's very creative when it comes to connecting issues that are vital in a very material way to people's welfare, to issues of culture and literature. And so those could provide some really interesting avenues as far as thinking about humanities programming. So I think as we think about this project in the future, just imagining our faculty and students as conduits to our communities that can really make it possible for us to increase the vitality of humanities research and programming. That's sort of where my brain has been going ever since we got those conversations started. But anyway, that was just a little intrusion before we get to Enid. I think you're next on the list. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, everybody. I was happy for the little segue because there was a loud beeping in the background. I readied my headphones just in case. But I want to first of all say thank you so much for allowing us to share some of the amazing things that we're doing at Kennedy King College to engage our students in the humanities. And it is an honor to be on the panel, so thank you. We were very fortunate, particularly in the Media Communications Department, to engage our students with a project that was actually with another one of the humanities organizations, and that was Illinois Humanities, which led us to a project with the Landmark Illinois organization, who is known for all kinds of projects around preservation of places, particularly in areas where people don't understand the value of what a place means in a community. And we were fortunate enough, my students and I, to go to 8 different locations around the state of Illinois to do and create amazing videos about people saving places in their respective areas. It was so really a really amazing experience for not just for me, who has always been a preservationist at heart, but to actually take a group of students who otherwise normally would not have considered about anything about preservation, particularly because we are in an area where we see nothing but the destruction of places and spaces that tie us back to the roots in Inglewood. I wanted to clarify that Kennedy King College is located proudly in the heart of Inglewood. And so to expose our students to this amazing journey where they actually traveled around and really began to get and understand a sense of place. And then to come back into our community and say, hey, gee, well, what about us? And to give them the foundation and the understanding about what it takes. And as we all know, it takes people. It takes people who are aware, who are sensitive, who want to save places. And for me, that was one of the really foundational entrees into the discussion about humanities. Humanities is the place where all of this lives. And while we have a very robust offering of courses in humanities, this actually took it one step further and it made it real. So can you imagine a student who is taking a humanities course and you see all of the ancient civilizations and all of those things, but now to actually bring that contextually into a space where it is very real for them. And they are in a space that has been reclaimed by the community, refurbished, and now repackaged or repurposed, and what it means for that community. And so we were very proud and extremely honored to be a part of that project. Moving forward, we are now embarking on something that we probably would have either completed or been very close to completing now, and that is a documentary on the history of Kennedy King College. Now, this all started when we, by happenstance, were partnered with yet another organization, Know Your Chicago, which, as you know, brings people into areas and spaces that they don't normally know about. And we were tasked, once again, my little hapless group of media communication students and communication design students, we were tasked with creating a video about the history of Inglewood, so that as this group of people who, once again, because of the packaging and because of the, in our opinion, very false narrative about Inglewood. Listen, there's two sides to every story, right? And so while we do acknowledge that we are all living in times where things could be done better, yes, but there's also a piece of the story of our narrative that never gets to be told. And so this is where we were able to come in and talk about the illustrious history of Inglewood, about how it was started, about it was a junction where all of the train and all of the movement into the city of Chicago began, and how the railroad industry was the backbone to that community, and how it brought together all these other people, immigrants, mind you, coming, and it was the junction. And so we were able to cobble together that story to contextualize an Inglewood that most people normally would never have been aware of or even interested in, because it's so usurped by this other narrative that we see all so well, and that is continually reiterated at every point in a very negative way that could actually have a very negative impact, especially on the students who we serve. So we said, we should do a documentary about our school, the history of education, and that we are an educational facility right in the heart of Inglewood, that we do provide students and community with an opportunity to understand that there are two sides to the story, and particularly in the media program, where once again, students are really encouraged to tell their stories. You see, ladies and gentlemen, my job and our job in our program is not to tell people about what their story is. It is to empower them, to give them resources and access, and to teach them to use the equipment and the resources to tell their story. And it is because of that we are honored and really indeed profoundly appreciative to the Chicago Humanities Festival for understanding the passion and the focus of what we're doing our Dean Darby Johnson will actually talk to you about the bigger project that we are embarking on our campus, which is affectionately known as SECA. And there are 4 pillars of SECA. But once again, SECA is that piece that endeavors to bring humanities, art, theater, film, music back into our community. And once again, providing us an opportunity to reclaim our role as an institution and be the beacon of hope in our community, where humanities can once again live, not just be something that is in a textbook, but is actually living and thriving in a real way where people can touch it and be immersed in it and be a part of it, but also create it. And so thank you so much for this unique and an unprecedented opportunity. And yes, we are living in unprecedented times where we have to use the resources that we have. We know that as an institution. So being flexible, being able to utilize the resources that we have is something that we have done all too well. And so we appreciate this platform and the time during this amazing summit to kind of share some of the things that we're doing at our institution. And thank you so much, Mark, and everybody on the panel. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
I'm going to add very little because, as you can see, I'm the luckiest administrator in the world to have Dr. Wells on my team. My job is to provide the support and the access and the resources to make sure that this is a priority. And that's exactly what we hope to do with our Center of Excellence for Creative Arts at Kennedy King. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. We've been hearing all day about how pandemics test us, right? They push us to our limits, and it certainly tested Kennedy King and the Englewood communities. And as Dr. Stovall pointed out, COVID magnifies the disparities we've already been seeing. Englewood has suffered deeply from the effects of systemic racism, systematic injustice, divestment, a lack of access to resources, and often a lack of respect for residents' voices. And our aspiration is to amplify those voices, not just of challenge, but of our beautiful past, of our imagined future, as Enid said, for our students and our community to tell their stories in their voice without interruption, without censorship, without people telling them how they should tell it in whatever medium they choose: film, cinema, music, theater, writing. We're encouraging that. And so we were very lucky. We got a new president, we had a new chancellor, and Enid and I had a dream. And we went and told them that dream, and they said, do it. Go, do it. So we did. So here's where we are. The goals of SECA are to seek to promote the arts in our community, to bring equitable education and career pathways in the arts to the Englewood community, which currently there are very few pathways to careers: behind the camera, in front of the camera, behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. But also to provide spaces for people to tell their stories, as we've said, in whatever medium they choose, and to serve as an incubator and hub for creative expression. So I'm hopeful that those of you that are listening today, when we're able to be in person again, that you will come to Englewood and see us and participate in our space with us. The virtual conversation is wonderful, but we hope to see you in Englewood too. So we are very happy. Thank you so much, Alison and Ira, for bringing us to the table. We are ecstatic that you've involved us in this conversation. Mark, as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are looking for ways to promote the arts in our community. We want the outreach for our students to be beyond the boundaries of Englewood. So please continue to include us. And again, we thank you.
And the facilities at Kennedy King are really just quite amazing. And I think very few people outside of that community know how great the theater, but also the TV studio.
I'll brag a little bit. So we have an amazing 300-person theater. We have a full sound stage that is of the quality that TV shows can be shot there. We have a radio station. We have a student-run restaurant that can do catering for events. We have a second black box theater. These are heavily underutilized, and we are seeking, when this is over with, and again, it's just so sad, Alison talking about the season being released and like cut, we had a whole series of programming for this year to bring. But next year it will happen.
I'm just going to echo a lot of what's been said, and so many of my thoughts dovetail really nicely with the voices that we've heard already. So again, thank you to the Humanities Festival for bringing us into this conversation, and also to UIC for hosting it. And it's really exciting to hear about what's happening at UIC and Kennedy King, and I feel like we need to follow up afterwards about some of these things. But yes, as I said before, I teach theater at Lake Forest College. And we're a very small liberal arts college, all undergrads in Lake Forest, Illinois, so on the North Shore. And so when I think about what it is to be sort of attuned to the neighborhood, I think about like how that question has such a particular charge right now. So my college has gone completely into remote learning for this semester. And luckily we had a little bit more time to plan than some other institutions. We didn't start and then go back. So we're really lucky in that sense. But I'm thinking back to something that Alison said at the beginning of this conversation about there's a loss to not necessarily having a physically shared space. And then there's also a lot of opportunities as well. And it actually sort of forces us into a kind of expansive definition of neighborhood and community, which is challenging and exciting, as Alison suggested before. So I actually taught over the summer, and so I had this incredible experience of one of my courses. There were 18 students. Every time zone in the United States was represented, and also a student from Hawaii, another from Japan, another from Colombia, another from Turkey, all zooming in whatever time it was in their home to get together and talk about performance art and poetry, and it was really quite moving. Our student body is very interesting. As I said, we're located in the North Shore. We certainly have a fair number of students from Illinois, but we actually have students from all over the country and from all over the world. We have a sort of surprisingly large number of international students, and certainly all over the city, including Englewood. And so when we think about what it means to provide that liberal arts, small classroom discussion-based experience for students in this remote environment, I really find myself thinking a lot about how we can foster collaborations and how we actually teach our students to do that in their wider lives by modeling it in the classroom as well. And obviously, as somebody who studies and is a practitioner of theater, like all things collaborative, like that's the way my brain works. Like that's really exciting to me to figure out how to do that in these Zoom conversations like we're having right now. And when I think about this sort of general question that we've been posed about how we ignite participation in the humanities and neighborhoods, I think that really what we're saying, and I'm hearing this a lot in what Professor Wells just spoke about, is how do we teach our students to be outward facing? How do we teach them to really look at the world around them and think about their place in it? Not just in terms of what they are going to achieve in their lives or their own survival, but literally like what is their place in a larger community? And thinking about how we can continue to teach our students to have that kind of outward focused mentality when we're existing in these boxes is, again, a challenge, but already we're discovering great ways that we can do that. So I have personally been really inspired by some of my colleagues at Lake Forest. One of the nice things about a tiny school where the entire faculty fits in one room, basically, it's a big room, but one room, is that you kind of really get to know people in lots of other disciplines. So I'm really inspired by work that a psychology professor is doing right now. where she integrates her students into her research with folks who have been victims of sexual violence, affiliated with the Heartland Alliance, or another colleague of mine in the history department who I know has Courtney Joseph, who's also working with the Chicago Humanities Festival, who teaches oral history skills to her students, and again has been working on a large oral history project about the Haitian community in Chicago. And when I say I'm inspired by their work, it's not just what they've done, but the way that they so quickly pivoted this spring to figuring out how to continue doing this work. And for them, the work is always not just their own research, but how they're teaching students through their research, how they pivoted so quickly to figuring out how to continue these oral history projects, this research gathering in the online space. So not letting go of these projects, but making sure that the students were thinking critically about how the rules of that kind of engagement had to change, but also why that work is so important to continue to do. And I find in my own theater courses, I have really sort of shifted the focus over the summer, and as we head into the fall now, into similarly interview-based projects. So this is why Professor Wells, we definitely need to talk at some point. So I think a lot of what you're doing at Kennedy King is really exciting. And now I'm thinking like, oh, my students need to talk to your students. And I'm coming at it through a theatrical perspective. So really, really giving my students more assignments where they have to interview people in their lives. They have to interview people who are essential workers. They have to interview people who are caretakers. They have to interview older members of their community, as a way, again, of making them think about what their community is and to sort of remain facing outwards. This is a really interesting time to be somebody who loves and makes theater. I think it's strange to watch your entire discipline and field just disappear overnight. I mean, the city and the country are filled with empty theaters right now, where sets for shows that were supposed to open on March 13th are just still sitting there empty. And there's a lot of loss there. And there's a lot of artists that are trying to figure out like, okay, so what are the skills that we have that can still be utilized as we kind of respond to these larger societal changes? And so I find myself thinking a lot about docudrama as a form. For many reasons, because it is interview-based. So when I work on docudramas with students, they face outwards again, but also because docudramas, so projects that are kind of created out of interviews, are a way of being very collaborative with a community, and also a way of documenting a moment in time. There's a piece right now up on the Public's website in New York called Essential, which is interviews with essential workers. Coincidentally, something similarly I did with my students as well. And I think that creating this kind of work right now, often it translates well actually to an online performance, is such a great example of how the humanities can kind of heal us in this time and also provide the documentation of this time. These are going to be incredible archival resources as scripts, as videos, as historians kind of write the story of the pandemic and the uprisings of this summer. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. And just once again, it's really inspiring to hear all of you, and I'm glad to be here.
Mark, is it okay if I jump in? I just was struck. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm struck by how much focus there is on storytelling and narrative and elevating voices, but in a way that, so we think about what experiences count or don't, which are included, which aren't, what narratives fix our community in certain ways, as you were saying, Dr. Wells, earlier. And we're thinking about that in a way that doesn't privilege one or the other, that students' stories, that the kind of oral histories that you're all engaged in different ways are just as important as the scholarship you were talking about and these partnerships and collaborations that are developing through that framework as well. Like, I find that just a really fascinating opportunity in this moment that we can really focus in on and amplify. And I'm struck too by, when I was talking about the audiences that we're reaching, and Chloe, you reminded me of, like, we're reaching so many people beyond Chicago and in Chicago, and we're talking a lot about Chicago right now. And I truly believe that art and culture and the humanities are one of the most positive expressions of what Chicago is. And what community looks like in Chicago. And we need to elevate those narratives. And right now we have that opportunity through these platforms, because we're reaching so many people outside of Chicago, to shift that narrative, to use the power of our collective work and voices and collaborations to really put forth this different image. I mean, I know that was something that really drove our initial interest in neighborhood programming, to really be able to tell stories of neighborhoods in Chicago that went beyond this idea of these neighborhoods are in crisis, they need someone come in and save them. No, these neighborhoods are full of resources of art and humanities and expression that aren't being elevated in quite that way, in the way that they need to be, so that those narratives can shift. And I'm just really struck right now by how much we're already kind of making those connections across our different institutions that could drive our work forward.
Thank you for bringing that up, Alison. As a way of bringing the threads together, and thank you again, and Ira, for just giving all of us the opportunity to combine our efforts and to start these collaborations together. And I think that we're all just kind of fascinated with each other's work at the moment, and we're going to be seeing a lot of ways in which we can connect the dots to move forward. My brain is kind of on overdrive thinking about the fascinating work that people are doing, from the site-specific work that Enid was talking about, to these ideas of the docudrama that Chloe was mentioning. I can't wait to see these actually in their material format, when they are available. Enid, are your documentaries, are they actually available for viewing?
Yes, the 8 projects that we did for Landmark, Illinois are available via YouTube, and I would love to provide you with the link after we have I'll group them all together for everybody, and you could take a look at them. So we traveled around the state. We went in, and once again, we wanted the emphasis was on people saving places was the arc of all of the projects. And it was really important that we talked to the people, students interviewed the people who were instrumental in all aspects of the project. So people who were fundraising, people who knew what the previous life of the space was and could talk to what it meant in community at that point, and then all of the people who worked together to bring it back to its glory. We were in Belleville, Illinois. We went down to we did a piece on the Bucky Fuller Dome Home down in Carbondale, all the way to a beautiful old Victorian right in Inglewood that was passed from generation to generation to generation of an African-American family, and how the gentleman is a descendant of the person who bought it, and how they continue to restore it in its original and being very true to its original architect and what that means for the Inglewood community. Like, who knew an old Victorian in Inglewood, right? So we were privileged, and it was such an amazing experience. So yes, I'll be able to share those with you, Mark. Thank you for asking.
And first of all, remind me of the church one that you were working on in Englewood, the church that had the fire.
Yes. The shrine, we worked with the, thank you, Ira, for bringing that one up too. We also worked with the Save the Shrine group over in Woodlawn for the restoration of the Shrine of Christ the King, which suffered not one but 2 major fires. It was slated for demolition. Once again, the people in that community came together, petitioned the Archdiocese of Chicago, and we were instrumental in actually being able to kind of start telling that story as a part of their project to help to restore and bring it back. I know that they were really moving along, and then, COVID has happened, but we also have a repository of everything that we covered for them that we have committed to gift to them as a part of their living and thriving artifact and resources to document part of that experience.
I just remember it being such a moving story that they had burned down and rebuilt and then burned down again, and then we're just really determined to stay.
Yeah, we'll be able to provide all of the links to you, Mark. Okay.
That would be wonderful. We do have some questions and comments coming up, so I wanted to get to those and see what people have to say about them. Sarah Hall is in on our conversation, and she says that she would like to say that given the centrality of TV productions like Chicago Fire and Chicago PD to news job pathways in film and TV in spaces around Chicago, she says that she'd be eager to work with colleagues and students on expanding the critical perspective on how such shows engage in copaganda. That is wonderful. And thinking about how the TV police promotion knot can be untangled and challenged by diversifying who is involved in writing and directing these shows behind the scenes. See the Color of Change report that came out in January as a reference. I think that just getting back to this idea of the idea of policing and surveillance as a cultural issue, and one that's involved in current production, and also that has such an interesting history. I think that part of what we can all be doing as we think about the conversations with our communities, and one thing that is just so inspiring to me about Enid's project is that it gets people interested in history and the way that history frames the present, and that we are part of a community that the possibilities of which have been partly they are partly the result of the past, and so using these as opportunities for thinking about cultural history. But specifically, Sarah's question about the relationship between TV and police, is that something that people are talking about, that people have an interest in? Maybe we could talk about that.
I was just going to say quickly that the Chicago Film Office has new leadership, Kwame Amwaku, who's a veteran of the industry. And we're doing a conversation this fall with some independent filmmakers talking about the future of filmmaking in Chicago. And I think this is a real opportunity because we have new leadership. There's a real desire to try and expand Chicago as a production hub. So it's not just the talent in front of the cameras, but behind the scenes, like making the production richer and deeper here and elevating Chicago stories. And so if that's, to come back to stories again, if that's the kind of dynamic, to try and engage with that process so that those stories do better reflect the city in the way that we've been talking about, and are less these kinds of, as Sarah was saying, propaganda, but more like The Shy or something. They's trying to get at the complexity of life in Chicago neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I would just throw out there that things are starting to begin to be shot again in Chicago, but that there's also been a pause in that industry as well. And even as things come back, it's going to, I think we anticipate it'll be at a much slower rate too. So how can we use the fact that that our industries have been upended to actually take a breath and say, okay, what we're at this moment where we're recognizing how harmful so many of the stories that we've circulated have been. What are the alternate stories? It's the work that Professor Wells's students are doing. Like we have to have the alternate stories to fill that as we let go of what's been harmful.
I also think that when you have people of color or a more diverse perspective, that we move away from kind of the myopic way that we may frame a particular story or an issue. And I think it also allows us, just as people, and particularly those of us who have a heart for humanities and looking at things from a humanitarian perspective, that it also kind of allows us to kind of shift and also kind of relook at a perspective, even in a way that we may not necessarily agree with, but we understand that the story and the narrative needs to be told. And I think that's something that I'm really proud of that we do at school. I want to be clear that we don't, we're not always trying to get the buy-in. Like, students have real things and from a different perspective. And so the question becomes, how do we really engage with them so that it's an authentic way of looking at real issues vis-a-vis, I worked in TV for 23 years, and I kind of didn't want to talk about that at the beginning because my true passion in life is an academician that started about almost 12 years ago. But because I have that background and I have that point of reference, we know that there is a way that the story is told. However, what we want to do, especially in invoking the humanities perspective, is that we do give that point of perspective and that framing that allows us much more depth and breadth to something. And it also gives us more time. Everything that we see now is a soundbite. Right. We're trying to cram in so many sound bites in a very short amount of time, but this gives us a chance to really peel back the layers and really get into a thing in a way that mainstream media may not be able to, or at least not have a directive to do.
I mean, one thing that the humanities can do, or certainly humanities programming of the sort that we're talking about, or documentary filmmaking or documentary theater, sounds obvious, but is doing the work of humanizing, right, and like connecting, these big issues with sort of the lived experience of being in these places. So, like Alison was talking about before, the idea of the neighborhood check-in being partly about like in the abstract, we have this sense of the pandemic is hitting communities of color differently than it's hitting white and more affluent communities everywhere and in Chicago. But that's very different than than having an hour talking to people who are activists and artists and sort of anchor community members in Englewood who talked about the work that they were doing to get food out, but also talked about like finding joy and comfort and intimacy and pleasure in the in the time, just like all of us, and I thought really getting to have those, and even the experience of being on Zoom and seeing people in their homes, I find is so different than seeing everybody presented on a stage with the same backdrop, right? You have a sense of our similarity and our difference in some way, right? We have a sense of we are all living real lives and they have details to them and they have comforts to them and challenges. And I think so many people, I think it's such a tick, and we all do this of say like, oh, the pandemic came, we had to switch, it's been a challenge, but we've actually found like it's been an advantage in some ways, or we've found surprising things. But I wonder what happens if we kind of lean into that and say like what do we really want to actually preserve from this time? And certainly I'm the last person who would resist going back to, I want to go back to live programming, as soon as possible. But there are things that, the ability to have these cross conversations so easily, that I think we, is worth pausing and saying, that's going to change. However, we get back to live programming, people aren't going to travel in the same way that we can connect on Zoom.
Ira, the many conversations that this group has had, we would have never been able to have the number of conversations that we had and to put this together at the speed at which we put this together, except in a virtual environment. Just completely impossible. So I want to remember that some things are actually more effectively done this way, and expedient when we need to have large groups of people together. I don't want to give up the other, but I don't want to forget this either.
I know. I still miss the snacks. But
I know. I still want the snacks. And also I would, some of you I've never seen in person.
Yeah,
I would like to see you in person.
Yeah. I just wanted to chime in and just add, there's an aspect to this that I didn't talk too much about, but that I already talked to Ira a little bit about, which is hopefully, creating even a pipeline for Kennedy King students to come to UIC and join the Engaged Humanities Initiative and, and have that funding and that, opportunity to continue the work that they've started at Kennedy King. And I think with Ira, we were talking a little bit about even having one of the student showcases if we're ever in the same room physically ever again, but having a student showcase at Kennedy King, right? And
that would be fantastic
for students to sort of mix and mingle and meet each other and demystify that for them. And I think that would be really, really exciting. So, yeah.
Let's do it.
It was such a treat to see the work that your students are doing this morning. It would be, I can really imagine that in a venue like that, a day of humanities festival like programming,
in our theater.
Right.
Oh, in the theater, and the students really just love talking about their work and meeting other students. I don't know when everybody became not shy. Like I look at them today, like I would have been mortified to do half the things. They're like, "Oh yeah, can we go meet people? Can we talk about?" And they did such a great job.
I think that that's probably right in some ways. So it does. I'm a huge fan of impersonal spaces. Maybe it's because I get sick of my own bookcases. I'm looking at Alison Cuddy's bookcases, and I'm just having this terrible envy looking at her artfully arranged books. It's just, I was wondering if we could perhaps engage some of our attendees or each other in some discussion of the future direction of our collaboration, because we're talking about what we can be doing on the ground, things that everyone is already doing. That's something that's really clear from what we're talking about at the moment. And I'm kind of thinking, well, what next? What's the next chapter for thinking about our collaborations? And I guess because maybe it's partly just my job, I often think about what's the next program going to be. What's the next big thing? And so do people have ideas about the best way in which we can talk with each other about the content of programs, and how do we reach out in the best possible way to our students and our faculty and the connections that they already bring to the table, and what are the ways in which we can work, dialectically, for want of a better word, to provide assistance and ideas for building on those energies in order to think of innovative programming in the year ahead. Do people have thoughts about that?
I like Ellen's idea of a student showcase and perhaps even traveling that to where we have students from all three of our campuses going to visit the other ones and showcasing the work that's being done in the humanities at that school and seeing the facilities, and even having time to have an open discussion with one another about reframing narrative. I think that would be amazing.
I agree. Ellen, it's so funny when you said showcase, I almost started crying. As Dean Darby will tell you, every semester.
She's the showcase queen.
Right, we have our media students and comm design students, and then we did a collaboration, you guys, with theater. So
That's
Professor
fun.
Johnston, it was so amazing, and the theater students actually read scenes from August Wilson's work, and so it was it was so beautiful, but it was a showcase. And I agree. I think when we have a showcase, you guys come and see what our students are doing. And we did a collaboration with art, so student art projects. Lined the hallways, and then you came into the theater. You had the media students and the theater students. So I agree. When times are better and we are actually back in an area where we can travel, we have an invitation extended to everybody to please come to Kennedy King. Even the participants come. Look at the work that our students are doing, and come and see our beautiful campus. Traveling, yes, showcase, absolutely.
Fantastic.
I mean, I'd like to put out the question to those of us from these institutions, but also anybody else in the conversation of who else should be in this conversation. Who else?
The students,
right? I want to keep expanding this, right? Students at these institutions, I think for sure, but also what other organizations, what other institutions, what kinds of entities should we be reaching out to? Because that's really where I am in my process and thinking about who to target.
I think that's a great idea. To have that as part of the conversation, and I've worked a little bit in the past year with Heartland Alliance, and they're a really fantastic collaborator for humanities programming, and they really show up in every possible way, intellectually and physically, to events. They're just really, really great. And Rachel Haverlock just submitted something to our chat about kind of connecting with Enid's project. What about a version of this for Saving Place in Chicago metro neighborhoods? Focusing on saving place in our immediate region could occur on video, audio, film, digital storytelling, and eventually live events. That could be really exciting as well.
Absolutely. That would be so incredibly insightful, and really be something that students I really think would resonate with as well.
I wanted to jump in on that idea from Rachel and the work that Dr. Wells talked about earlier. Part of the process for this developing a neighborhood partnership and engagement strategy and bringing all these different entities like ours together is like, what is that process going to look like? And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and we're going to kick off with a conversation about this, including Courtney Joseph from Lake Forest, at the beginning of our fall season, is the whole question of memorials and memorializing, and what does that process look like at a neighborhood level? Because what is it, like, I think this aligns with what Rachel was talking about, Saving Place, and the projects that your students were engaged in. Dr. Wells is like, what is a value in our community, and how do we showcase that? How do we mark that? How do we preserve that and share that with other communities? And it seems like a project like that could be a process of having conversations about how do you collaborate. It could be a process that students plug into, share their own experiences, or do oral histories with others in the community. It could be a place where faculty come and talk about, more maybe abstract way, like what we're talking about when we're talking about memorializing, and connecting that to the way communities are discussing that amongst themselves. And then out of that, as we're saying, could evolve some really powerful, large public programs. So to me, it feels like we need a kind of joint project to work together on over the coming year that we could bring all these different constituents in together to work on and keep talking about. And I'm hoping that part of that, our literally next, Mark, is that conversation that I already talked about that we're going to have on September 9th among these different institutions, which is, again, asking the question, what does it mean to be a good neighbor in this time? And I think there's a connection there, right, between the process in general that we're going to embark on for the next year. How do we be good neighbors to one another? How do we connect to one another?
Yeah, I think about also like how being a good neighbor is seeing somebody, like seeing somebody for who they really are, and not just your idea of your idea of who they are or who they should be, or so I don't know. I'm again sort of back to the students and what they could do with these ideas, but yeah, I find myself thinking a lot about how students from different campuses too could engage, not just about spaces, but also about their different experiences of the pandemic as well, and kind of bearing witness to these different experiences in different parts of the city and the world, and how powerful that would be for them, and how much it would sort of complicate the narrative that we get from the media, yeah. So I would love for our students to be able to collaborate and bear witness to one another.
And if there's a way, Chloe, like to have students writing a script that others are performing, that the media students are recording, it's broadcast on the radio station. I mean, there's all types of possibilities for that level of collaboration across disciplines.
Love that.
And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the world of streaming now. So we're not.
We can stream it too.
We've done our piece and learned our way through streaming different events, live and otherwise. So that's also another amazing platform. I just wanted to throw that one out there.
I just learned that I need to get myself an Ethernet cord since I just dropped off.
I wondered what happened to you. You might also want to get a booster.
Right. Yeah, I got a booster and it's not boosting quite enough, I guess.
So straight hard Ethernet cable then.
A 25-foot cord that I'm going to run from one room to the next.
Can we respond to something that we're seeing in the chat as well?
When I got off of, when I was bumped off, I kind of lost track here. I lost a lot of the chats. But Sarah Hall writes about a memorial project on the 1919 race riots, yeah. So maybe this is something that also can connect to some of the student work. That the memorials are not just about places, but about actual important events. And yeah, so I think that's an important aspect of this.
Alison, are we going to have a memorial theme
for next year? It could connect.
But we do have the memorial program.
Yeah.
Right.
That she mentioned starting.
I think also, it's really on my mind because, what's been happening. Well, a couple things. One, that the city has formed this committee that I think they're about to announce or have announced of people who are going to try and develop a process for thinking about memorials. So not just what should come down, but what this whole thing means. And if we could build on that and bring that into more public, I think they're going to be doing things. I went to a protest on 79th Street, and it was organized by My Block, My Hood, My City, who we partnered with on neighborhood programming before. And at the end of it, this very impromptu memorial assembled. So it ended right along the highway, and there was like a chain link fence, and all of a sudden people started putting up pieces of paper that had names on them, people who had been experienced some kind of brutality to come back to policing at the hands of the Chicago police. And so this whole fence in pretty short order got covered with these sheets of paper with these names. And I don't know what happened to it. I haven't gone back. Like, is it still there? And I think we're seeing a lot of these kinds of impromptu memorials coming up as part of the protests in the city. And lots of people are thinking, how do we preserve that? But it just sort of invites a different conversation that I think we're all kind of excited about. But yeah, so we will be talking about it this fall, but I think the city will be as well. And so it'd be great if we could help drive that through this.
Connected to some of these discussions is a conference that is coming up at UIC. We've been talking a little bit about documenting the present, and we have a conference on October 29th and 30th called Different Archives, Different Histories. And this importance of archiving the moment, both in terms of the pandemic and also in terms of violence and surveillance and resistance. These are some of the themes that we're going to be talking about at this conference. And so perhaps it would be great to have as many people in on that conference and the discussions as possible, because some of the issues that we're talking about are so connected to the themes in that conference that maybe archiving, the practice of archiving, of preservation, and particularly the preservation of the present moment could come up in some of our collaborations in the future. And I'm just going to give you the link for that conference so that you can learn about it and register for it. Again, it's going to be on our beloved Zoom. We're going to be doing this for a long time, I guess, but it would be great to have all of you there at that and use that as a springboard for some of these collaborations.
I had in my many imaginings of versions of neighborhood programming or neighborhood projects that we could undertake, thought about connecting public programming to a kind of community archiving project of some sort, right? To find a kind of unremembered or little remembered neighborhood history or set of neighborhood histories, and use public conversations as a way to kind of pull out people who have connections to those histories, and pull out their ephemera and their memories, and then create some kind of physical record or document. And there's I forget where it was. I think I shared it with you at some point else. And there's a grant for those kind of like neighborhood archiving projects that I was interested in going back to maybe in the future, because it seemed really promising possibility.
And just on the note of who else we could talk to, and I'm assuming this is occurred to you, the Newberry Library, right, is a great partner, and I know that they've been doing a lot with the 1919 Project, and I think they did some archiving of like the Women's March in 2016 with the signs, and that's also a great resource.
I think we should also pull in the DuSable, because they have an archiving project as well, and they are a Smithsonian affiliated institution. And I know they're interested in oral histories and preservation.
Right, and the DuSable also did a project about the 1919 riot.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and we are having Skyla Century, who was at the DuSable Museum. She is going to be coming to talk at our conference. So
perfect.
Yeah, so she'll be fantastic, and she's a really wonderful speaker, great collaborator. So and yeah, I love this idea of a community archive project that really could connect with a lot of the things that we're talking about. At Kennedy King, how much have you been working with like digital humanities, like online projects, posting student projects?
Not
online?
much.
Not
Because
much.
we really don't have a huge population of students who are humanities majors, but we pull it through the film and media program, and then I was saying that we are pushing several programs through the curricular process. So when we have our film and cinema program, that will become part of that. So it's going to be a little bit, but that's definitely part of the conversation.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We have just started doing this at the Humanities Institute, a digital humanities initiative. And so if you had students who were interested in doing online projects, that could be a possible collaboration with those students. And then, we can think in the future about ways in which we can put our strengths together. And because, we don't really have the media production at all.
Dr. Wells does.
Right. So, I mean,
very much so. And interns too.
See, it's a perfect.
It is. We have a couple of interns too. So, because this is once again another really amazing touch point for students to be able to work collaboratively outside of our space. So, any and all suggestions are welcome, and I'm your point person. So, absolutely, and thank you so much.
And knowing this far ahead of time too, Dr. Wells plans capstone projects for her students.
Yes.
They go and you would be their client.
Wow. Okay.
And they do the full production. So knowing in advance of semesters about things that you might be interested in is very helpful to her in her planning.
That's really exciting. We are nearing the end of our programming here. Alison and Ira, did you want to add anything as we wrap things up here?
I mean, I want to thank you again, and thank everybody for being so generous with your time and your thoughts. And I really hope that we'll have slightly different representation from the different institutions, but this conversation is going to continue on the 9th in a public way. It's obviously going to continue in emails and on other meetings as well. But I really want to invite everybody who's been watching to follow this conversation and to keep contributing, because I really think that part of my goal is we want to start with these really strong key institutional partnerships, but we want those to open up and to be avenues in for the communities that we're working with to then add to and add on to that. And so I'm excited to kind of expand and bring in more interlocutors.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And the kind of creative thinking and ideas for collaboration that we've just discussed today and in previous conversations is, I think, the ultimate goal of this project. So it's always great to hear it happening. And thank you so much, Mark, for organizing this. Looking forward to our next meeting.
I am too. Thank you, Ira and Alison, and thanks to everyone for joining in for all of our sessions. And thanks also to our generous audience for listening in and participating. We've really gotten a lot out of these discussions today, and I hope to continue them into the future. One thing that I've gotten out of this, as I always get, is that humanities is everywhere. People are out there doing it all the time, but it's even better when we get together to combine our forces and make it even bigger and better than it is when we're sometimes caught in our lonely spaces doing what we do. So the collaborations mean not everything, but they magnify, they celebrate, and they extend all of the efforts that we're doing. So I'm grateful for all of us coming together to further the great work that people are doing. So thanks to everyone. Stay safe, and good luck with the beginning of the semester, as I think a lot of us are about to do, or maybe we're already doing it. And I look forward to seeing people virtually, and even better, seeing you all in person. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye, everybody.